A noble marriage in Tudor England could begin with the quiet disappearance of a woman. No trial, no scandal, and often no explanation. Only silence where her presence once existed. Behind the alliances that strengthened great families, private relationships were carefully erased so that power could appear clean and unquestioned. The official story celebrated loyal wives and legitimate heirs. But hidden beneath that order were lives that vanished from memory the moment they became inconvenient. Tonight, we step into the quiet politics of Tudor marriage, where alliances reshaped households and one woman's disappearance made stability possible. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If someone had quietly observed the negotiations inside a Tudor noble household, marriage would not have looked like a romantic promise between two people. It would have looked more like the drafting of a legal agreement. Papers were unfolded across heavy wooden tables. Seals were prepared, and relatives discussed boundaries of land and inheritance rights with careful attention. The bride and groom themselves often played only a small role in these early conversations. In Tudor England, a marriage could transform the balance of power within an entire region. Land passed through families not only through inheritance, but through carefully arranged unions. When two noble houses agreed on a marriage, they were not simply creating a family connection. They were linking estates, income, and influence in a way that could strengthen both sides for decades. A bride might bring large areas of farmland, woodland, or valuable rents collected from tenants. These properties immediately became part of the husband's household economy. The wealth could support new political ambitions, fund a larger household, or help the family maintain a stronger presence at court. Titles were also part of the calculation. If the bride came from a respected lineage, her family name carried its own influence. The union joined not only properties but reputations. A man whose family was rising could gain legitimacy by marrying into an older, noble line. A declining family could restore its status through a strategic match with someone whose fortune was expanding. Because of this, marriage negotiations were often conducted with the same seriousness as political diplomacy. Fathers consulted lawyers. Uncles calculated inheritance rights. Trusted advisors considered how the alliance might affect relationships with other powerful families. The young man whose marriage was being arranged understood that his future position depended on these decisions. A strong marriage could stabilize his authority within the household and strengthen his influence in court politics. A weak marriage could invite criticism or limit his opportunities. For that reason, reputation mattered greatly. A man who appeared respectable and disciplined attracted better alliances. Families wanted to entrust their daughters to someone whose household seemed stable and honorable. Any sign of scandal or irresponsibility could damage these negotiations. The marriage contract itself often reflected these concerns in careful detail. It specified the dowry that the bride would bring, the lands she would control, and the provisions made for her if she became a widow. Every clause was designed to prevent disputes and ensure that property moved exactly as intended. From the outside, the wedding celebrations might appear joyful and romantic. Guests gathered in decorated halls. Musicians played, and the couple exchanged vows before witnesses. Yet behind this ceremony stood months or even years of negotiation. The alliance had already been planned long before the first guest arrived. For the man at the center of the arrangement, the marriage represented a step into greater stability. His household gained wealth. His reputation strengthened. His family expanded its network of allies. These changes could influence his future career in ways that ordinary friendships never could. Even daily life inside the household reflected this political reality. Servants understood that the arrival of a new wife from an influential family might bring additional staff. new financial resources, and new expectations of behavior. The household structure shifted quietly around the marriage. None of this meant that affection between husband and wife was impossible. Some couples did grow close over time. However, affection was never the primary reason for the union. The true purpose remained the protection of property, influence, and family honor. This practical view of marriage shaped the entire culture of Tudor nobility. Children were raised knowing that their future spouses would likely be chosen for them. Personal feelings were secondary to the survival and advancement of the family line. A noble marriage, therefore, was less a personal choice and more a piece of long-term strategy. Families planned these alliances carefully because the consequences could last for generations. Land that entered the household through marriage might remain there permanently. Titles could pass to future heirs. Political alliances formed at the wedding table might influence decisions made years later in the royal court. In this environment, stability mattered above everything else. Families preferred predictable arrangements that protected their interests. They avoided anything that might introduce uncertainty or embarrassment into the alliance. Even rumors could become dangerous if they suggested that the groom lacked discipline or respectability. Because of this, the life of a nobleman was closely examined by those arranging his marriage. Relatives paid attention to his habits, his friendships, and the reputation he carried within the community. A respectable appearance reassured potential allies. A questionable past could complicate negotiations. This scrutiny reveals how little room existed for private indulgence once a serious alliance was being discussed. Personal relationships that had once seemed harmless could suddenly appear risky. Within the quiet calculations of Tudor society, the marriage contract stood above nearly every other consideration. It determined wealth, reputation, and future influence. When such a contract was finally agreed upon, it reshaped the entire household. Servants adjusted their loyalties. Family members reorganized their expectations. Estates were prepared for new management and new heirs. The wedding ceremony itself might last only a day. The political consequences could last a lifetime. For the man entering this alliance, the benefits were obvious. His position within society became stronger. His household gained resources and connections that could support him for years. But every alliance required careful control over appearances. Nothing could be allowed to threaten the reputation that the marriage was meant to secure. And in a society that valued order and respectability above personal feeling, even small shadows from the past could suddenly become dangerous. In Tudor England, marriage was never simply about two people standing before a priest. It was a contract designed to unite land, power, and reputation under a single household. Yet once such a contract was arranged, every part of a man's past began to attract uncomfortable attention. And somewhere within that past, there might already be a woman whose existence no longer fit the future being planned. Within the structured world of Tudor aristocratic life, the position of a mistress existed in a narrow and uncertain space. She could be close to power, yet never truly part of it. Her presence might be known within the household, whispered about among servants, and quietly acknowledged by a few trusted companions of the nobleman. But outside these limited circles, her existence held no official place. Unlike a lawful wife, a mistress stood outside the protection of law and church. Tudor society was built upon clear hierarchies, and marriage sat firmly at the center of those structures. A wife brought dowry, lineage, and legitimacy. Her position was supported by legal contracts, religious recognition, and the authority of her family. Even when a marriage became unhappy, these institutions still provided a framework that preserved her place within the household. A mistress possessed none of these safeguards. Her relationship existed entirely through private understanding rather than public agreement. No document recorded her rights. No priest acknowledged her bond. If disputes arose, she had no court to defend her interests. The arrangement depended entirely on the continued favour of the man who supported her. At first, this dependence might not appear dangerous. Many noblemen treated their mistresses generously during the early stages of a relationship. They provided housing, clothing, and sometimes a modest allowance that allowed the woman to live in a manner far more comfortable than her earlier life. Within the walls of the residence given to her, the mistress could feel protected and valued, yet this comfort remained temporary by nature. Every aspect of her life was tied to a single source of support. The house she lived in might belong to the nobleman. The servants who attended her answered to his authority. Even the money that allowed her daily comfort arrived at his discretion. This dependence created a fragile balance. As long as the nobleman remained affectionate and attentive, the mistress might believe her position stable. She could move through certain social spaces with quiet confidence, welcomed by those who understood the relationship and accepted it as part of aristocratic life. Invitations might arrive for private gatherings. Gifts might appear on anniversaries or celebrations, but none of these gestures carried permanence. The moment the nobleman's interests changed, the entire arrangement could collapse. Unlike a wife, whose removal from the household required legal procedure and public explanation, a mistress could be dismissed with little formality. Sometimes the change occurred gradually. The nobleman might begin visiting less frequently. Conversations grew shorter. Gifts stopped arriving. The signs were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who understood the delicate rules governing such relationships. In other cases, the transition happened abruptly. A single conversation could end years of companionship. The nobleman might offer a final payment or promise assistance in arranging a new life elsewhere. These gestures were often framed as kindness, yet they also carried a clear message. The relationship had reached its conclusion. From that moment forward, the woman's position within the household effectively vanished. Servants who once treated her with courtesy returned to their ordinary duties. Friends who had visited during happier times became cautious about maintaining contact. Without the nobleman's visible support, the mistress no longer occupied a recognizable place within the social hierarchy. The absence of legal protection made this disappearance particularly swift. A wife could appeal to family members, clergy, or courts if her husband attempted to abandon his responsibilities. A mistress had no comparable recourse. Her survival depended entirely on personal negotiation. Some women attempted to secure their future through careful behavior during the relationship itself. They avoided public scandal and maintained discretion, hoping that loyalty would inspire long-term support. Others attempted to accumulate small savings from the gifts they received, quietly preparing for the possibility that their circumstances might change. Yet even these precautions offered limited security. The central problem remained unchanged. A mistress existed within a system that valued legitimacy above affection. Tudor society placed enormous importance on lawful marriage because it preserved inheritance, property rights, and political alliances. Relationships outside that structure remained tolerated only as long as they did not threaten the larger order. Once they began to interfere with those priorities, they became expendable. The nobleman himself often understood this reality from the beginning. He might express affection and generosity, yet he also recognized that his family expected him to pursue a respectable marriage eventually. When that moment arrived, personal attachments carried little weight against the demands of lineage and reputation. In this way, the life of a mistress reflected the wider logic of Tudor power. She lived near influence but without protection. She experienced comfort but without permanence. Her position depended on the shifting calculations of a world where alliances, property, and reputation determined nearly every decision. While the relationship lasted, the arrangement could appear almost stable. Yet beneath that appearance lay a constant uncertainty. At any moment, the balance could shift. A noble marriage might be proposed. A family member might intervene. A political opportunity might appear that requires a cleaner reputation. In each of these situations, The mistress represented a complication, and complications in Tudor society were rarely allowed to remain. The structure that once sheltered her could quietly withdraw its support, leaving her to rebuild a life outside the circles where she had once been welcomed. Her story rarely appeared in official records. The legal documents preserved the names of wives and heirs, not the women who existed beyond those boundaries. When the relationship ended, the household narrative simply moved forward without her. The absence itself became the final evidence of how fragile her position had always been. A Tudor mistress could enjoy moments of comfort and attention, yet her life rested entirely on the unstable foundation of another person's favour. The moment that favour began to weaken, the quiet security surrounding her started to dissolve, and once larger interests entered the picture, her place within the household could disappear with remarkable speed. Periods of political uncertainty often changed the private lives of Tudor nobles with surprising speed. What had once seemed stable inside a household could suddenly become fragile when events beyond the walls of the estate began to shift. War, financial strain, or disputes over succession did not remain distant, matters discussed only in royal chambers. They reached deeply into the daily calculations of aristocratic families. During such moments, alliances became urgent. A noble family watching the political landscape carefully understood that survival depended on choosing the right partners. If conflict threatened a region, or influence at court began to change hands, families moved quickly to strengthen their positions. Landowners sought allies who could offer military support, financial stability, or valuable connections within the royal government. Marriage provided one of the most reliable ways to secure those advantages. When a powerful alliance appeared possible, discussions began almost immediately. Letters travelled between estates. Trusted advisors met quietly to examine the benefits of the proposed union. The dowry of the bride was measured not only in money, but also in land and political influence. The negotiations could last weeks or months, but the purpose remained clear. A marriage had to reinforce the security of both families. In a time of uncertainty, a well-chosen alliance could protect property, reputation, and access to the royal court. War often accelerated this process. Aristocratic households were closely tied to military obligations. Noblemen owed service to the crown, and regional conflicts could quickly place pressure on their finances and manpower. Maintaining troops, repairing defences, or supporting campaigns required resources that many families struggled to sustain alone. A strategic marriage could relieve some of this burden. If a bride brought substantial property or strong family connections, the alliance might strengthen the household's ability to survive the crisis. Estates joined together could produce a higher income. Families that once competed might suddenly cooperate to protect shared interests. Debt created similar pressures. Life at the Tudor court was expensive. Maintaining a respectable household demanded servants, clothing, horses, and constant travel. When finances weakened, families searched urgently for solutions. A marriage that brought fresh resources could restore stability where years of spending had created vulnerability. In such circumstances, personal feelings became less important than practical advantage. The nobleman at the centre of these negotiations might have enjoyed a comfortable private life before the crisis emerged. He might have kept a mistress whose presence remained discreet and widely tolerated. As long as his situation appeared stable, few people questioned the arrangement. Political pressure changed that tolerance. When advisors began discussing marriage alliances, the existence of a mistress quickly became an obstacle. Families considering the union expected the groom to represent reliability and respectability. A visible relationship outside marriage raised doubts about discipline and judgment. The nobleman's relatives usually recognized the problem immediately. Parents, brothers, and influential uncles often played decisive roles during these negotiations. Their priority was the long-term survival of the family line. Any relationship that threatened the success of a political alliance had to be reconsidered. Private affection rarely outweighed those concerns. The mistress herself might notice the change before anyone spoke openly about it. Conversations around the household became more cautious. The nobleman might appear distracted, spending more time with relatives or advisors. Letters arrived less frequently, and visits that once occurred regularly began to fade. These signals reflected the growing influence of family strategy. Behind closed doors, discussions focused on the advantages of the proposed marriage. The bride's family might offer property that expanded the estate or political connections that opened doors at court. In a time of instability, such opportunities appeared too valuable to ignore. Once the negotiations advanced, the expectations surrounding the groom became stricter. He was no longer simply a private individual managing his personal affairs. He represented a future alliance between two families whose reputations and fortunes would soon become linked. Any sign of scandal could weaken that bond before it even formed. For this reason, advisors often insisted on removing every source of potential embarrassment. A mistress who had once been tolerated quietly could now appear dangerous. Her presence suggested divided loyalties or unresolved attachments. If rumors spread, the bride's family might question the sincerity of the match. In a society where reputation shaped political trust, even the possibility of gossip carried risk. The nobleman himself might feel conflicted. Personal attachment did not disappear easily, particularly if the relationship had lasted several years. Yet the scale of the decision extended far beyond individual feeling. Marriage negotiations involved entire families, estates, and political futures. Within that larger calculation, affection became secondary. What had once been a private comfort began to resemble a liability. Relatives reminded the nobleman of his responsibilities. Advisors warned about the dangers of appearing unreliable. Every argument pointed toward the same conclusion. The household needed a respectable marriage. The mistress, however valued she had once been, did not fit into that future. Her presence belonged to a different chapter of the nobleman's life, one that now conflicted with the demands of strategy and survival. As the marriage negotiations approached their final stages, the quiet understanding surrounding her position began to change. Servants noticed the shift. Friends became cautious in their conversation. The atmosphere within the household reflected the reality that a transformation was underway. When politics reshaped the priorities of a noble family, personal relationships rarely remained untouched. The alliance being constructed promised stability during uncertain times. Land, reputation, and influence would be secured through the coming marriage. But achieving that stability required careful control over every detail of the nobleman's public image. And in the careful order of Tudor society, there was little room for attachments that belonged outside the structure of lawful alliance. Moments of political uncertainty forced Tudor families to think less about affection and more about survival. As negotiations for a powerful marriage gained momentum, every aspect of the groom's life came under quiet scrutiny. Somewhere within those calculations, a private relationship was beginning to look like a problem that needed to disappear. The signing of a marriage agreement in Tudor society often appeared calm and orderly on the surface. Families gathered in well-lit rooms. Documents were placed carefully on tables, and witnesses stood nearby while the final terms were confirmed. The atmosphere carried a tone of satisfaction rather than tension. For both families, the agreement represented security, opportunity, and the promise of a stable future. Yet the quiet celebration concealed a difficult reality. A marriage contract did more than unite two individuals. It reorganized an entire network of relationships around the household. Every person connected to the nobleman suddenly found their position reconsidered in light of the coming alliance. The future bride, of course, would enter the household with recognition and authority. Her arrival would be marked by ceremony, by gifts, and by the approval of church and family. She would represent legitimacy and stability, two qualities that Tudor society valued above nearly everything else. Her family would also gain influence. Through the marriage, their interests became linked with those of the groom's household. Land and wealth might pass between estates, while political support strengthened the position of both families. What had once been separate households now shared a common future. In such circumstances, few people questioned the value of the alliance. Servants prepared for the arrival of the new mistress of the house. Relatives discussed the advantages the marriage would bring. Even neighbors recognized that the union represented a strategic success for everyone involved. Within this atmosphere of approval, however, one figure stood outside the arrangement. The woman who had once occupied the nobleman's private life did not appear in the contract. Her name was absent from the documents being signed. She held no recognized place within the negotiations that shaped the household's future. For the families gathered around the table, this absence seemed perfectly natural. The marriage contract concerned property, reputation, and inheritance. Only relationships recognized by law and the church deserved attention in such matters. A mistress belonged to a different world, one that polite society preferred not to acknowledge openly. Nevertheless, her presence could not be ignored entirely. Everyone involved understood that the nobleman had lived a life before this marriage was arranged. In many cases, that life included attachments formed in quieter circumstances. While those attachments remained private, they rarely threatened the stability of the household. The situation changed once the marriage contract was signed. From that moment onward, the nobleman represented not only himself, but also the alliance between the two families. His behavior reflected on the reputation of his bride and her relatives. Any lingering relationship that contradicted the image of a respectable husband could create embarrassment or suspicion. The problem, therefore, required careful attention. The future wife was not expected to surrender her place. The alliance depended on her legitimacy and the influence of her family. Questioning her position would undermine the very purpose of the marriage, nor would the powerful relatives involved in the negotiations withdraw their support. They had invested time, reputation, and resources in securing the agreement. The contract represented their strategic success. The only person whose position remained uncertain was the one who stood outside the formal structure. The mistress possessed no legal claim over the household's future. Her connection to the nobleman existed entirely through private affection. Once the marriage alliance took precedence, that affection became difficult to justify. In many households, the decision unfolded quietly. The nobleman might speak with her in private, explaining that circumstances had changed. He might offer financial support or assistance in arranging a different life elsewhere. These gestures often appeared generous. Yet they also carried a clear expectation. The relationship had to end. From the perspective of the families arranging the marriage, the solution seemed practical and reasonable. Removing the mistress ensured that the new bride entered the household without scandal. It preserved the appearance of order that aristocratic society demanded. The disappearance did not require a public announcement. Invitations simply stopped arriving. The woman who once visited certain houses or attended certain gatherings no longer appeared there. Servants adjusted their routines. Friends learned quickly that mentioning her name created discomfort. Gradually, the household narrative rewrote itself. Guests attending the wedding saw only the future being celebrated, a noble couple, respected families, and the promise of heirs who would inherit the combined strength of both lineages. The past remained carefully unspoken. For the woman who had once shared the nobleman's private life, this silence carried a different meaning. She had not committed a crime. She had not been formally accused of wrongdoing. Yet the structure of Tudor society left no place for her. Once the marriage alliance was confirmed, the household moved forward. She moved away. The contract remained intact. The alliance grew stronger, and the nobleman's reputation appeared secure. Those who observed the situation understood the logic behind the decision. Marriage protected power. Everything else could be removed when necessary. A marriage contract promised stability for two families and legitimacy for the household that would emerge from the alliance. Within that careful arrangement, the future bride and her powerful relatives remained firmly protected. The only figure without a place in the agreement was the woman whose presence belonged entirely to the past. Inside Tudor noble households, decisions about marriage rarely belonged to the man alone. Even if the groom appeared to stand at the center of the agreement, the real influence often surrounded him in the form of relatives and advisors who understood the broader consequences of his choices. A noble family functioned less like a group of individuals and more like a carefully managed institution. Every important decision carried implications that extended far beyond personal preference. When discussions of a strategic marriage began, the first voices to intervene usually came from within the family itself. A mother often held considerable influence in these matters. Having lived through the expectations of aristocratic marriage herself, she understood how fragile reputation could be. Her interest lay in securing stability for the household and protecting the family's standing among other noble families. If rumors existed about her son's private relationships, she recognized the potential danger immediately. Her advice might appear calm, even affectionate. Yet the message was usually clear. The family could not afford a scandal. Older brothers or uncles frequently added their opinions as well. These men often managed parts of the family estates or maintained connections within court politics. Their perspective focused heavily on long-term advantage. A marriage alliance that strengthened landholdings or expanded political influence carried far greater importance than any personal attachment. To them, the matter required practical judgment rather than sentiment. The presence of a mistress might once have been tolerated as a private indulgence. However, once a formal alliance was under discussion, that tolerance began to disappear. Family members understood that even small whispers could undermine the trust required for a successful marriage negotiation. A noble family, offering their daughter, expected assurance that the groom would present a respectable household. Any lingering connection with another woman threatened that image. In addition to relatives, legal advisors played an important role during this period. Tudor marriage contracts involved complicated arrangements concerning property, dowries, and inheritance rights. Lawyers examined every detail carefully to ensure that the agreement protected the interests of both families. These advisors were rarely concerned with emotion. Their responsibility was to identify risks. If the groom maintained a visible relationship outside marriage, the lawyers recognized the potential consequences immediately. A mistress could become a source of gossip. Gossip could weaken negotiations. In the worst circumstances, rumors might lead the bride's family to question the sincerity of the alliance. For this reason, legal advisors often recommended removing any element that might invite suspicion. Their language tended to remain formal and restrained. They spoke of reputation, stability, and the need to avoid unnecessary complications. Yet behind those careful words stood a direct warning. The relationship had to end. Family councils were sometimes formed quietly around this issue. Conversations took place in private chambers where the nobleman listened while relatives and advisors explained the dangers of continuing his attachment. Each participant approached the matter from a slightly different perspective, yet their conclusions often aligned. The mother worried about the household's honor. The brother calculated a political advantage. The lawyer considered legal vulnerability. Together, they created a united pressure that was difficult to resist. In such discussions, affection rarely carried significant weight. Even if the nobleman admitted that he cared for the woman involved, his relatives reminded him of responsibilities that extended beyond personal feeling. The family's reputation had been built across generations. Allowing scandal to threaten that legacy appeared irresponsible. They also emphasized the expectations of the bride's family. Marriage negotiations between powerful households depended heavily on trust. If one family believed that the groom remained emotionally entangled with another woman, the alliance could collapse before the wedding even occurred. Such an outcome would not only embarrass the groom, but also damage the reputation of his entire lineage. The warnings, therefore, became increasingly direct. Relatives reminded the nobleman that every household servant observed his behavior. Gossip moved easily through corridors. kitchens, and neighbouring estates. What began as a private rumour could quickly travel beyond the household and reach the ears of potential allies. Once those rumours spread, they could not easily be withdrawn. The nobleman might feel the pressure building around him from every direction. Conversations with advisors replaced the quieter moments he once shared with his mistress. The future marriage began to dominate discussions within the household, leaving little space for private attachments. Gradually, the message became unavoidable. The alliance required a clean reputation. Personal affection had to yield to family strategy. Within the world of Tudor aristocracy, loyalty to the household always outweighed loyalty to individual desire. The nobleman understood that his actions affected not only himself but also the fortunes of relatives, tenants, and future heirs. Under such circumstances, the decision that once seemed difficult began to appear inevitable. Family members and advisors rarely raised their voices, yet their arguments carried undeniable weight. Each conversation reminded the nobleman that his personal life now belonged to the calculations of family reputation and political advantage. Before long, the quiet pressure surrounding him would begin to reshape the future of a relationship that once seemed secure. In Tudor England, the authority of the church extended deeply into the structure of daily life. Religious teachings shaped not only private belief, but also public behaviour, especially among the nobility whose conduct was constantly observed by others. Marriage stood at the centre of this moral framework. It was not simply a personal arrangement between two people, but a sacred union recognised by the church and supported by long-standing religious tradition. Because of this, the expectations surrounding marriage carried enormous weight. A lawful marriage represented order, discipline, and moral stability. It created legitimate heirs, protected property rights, and demonstrated obedience to religious authority. When a noble couple stood before a priest to exchange vows, the ceremony symbolized more than personal commitment. It signaled that the household intended to live within the moral structure endorsed by the church. For families, negotiating a strategic alliance, this religious dimension mattered greatly. A respectable marriage strengthened the public image of both families. It reassured neighbours, political allies, and church leaders that the household followed the accepted rules of Christian society. Reputation and faith were closely connected, and any behaviour that appeared to challenge that connection could create suspicion. Within this environment, the presence of a mistress presented a clear moral problem. Although many aristocratic households quietly tolerated such relationships, the church viewed them as evidence of disorder. Sermons delivered in parish churches frequently emphasized the importance of marital fidelity. Priests warned congregations about the dangers of temptation and the consequences of living outside lawful marriage. These messages reached noble families as well as ordinary villagers. Even if a particular priest avoided direct criticism of powerful households, the language used in sermons left little room for doubt. A man who maintained a relationship outside marriage risked not only personal sin, but also the appearance of moral weakness. The distinction between private behaviour and public reputation was especially important. A nobleman might believe that his personal life remained discreet, yet the church's influence extended through the entire community. Servants attended services. Neighbours listened to the same sermons. Rumours often began in quiet corners after church gatherings, where small observations could grow into larger stories. In this way, moral pressure spread gradually through the social environment. The church did not need to accuse specific individuals. It simply reinforced the idea that respectable households should maintain clear boundaries between lawful marriage and illicit relationships. Once this expectation became widely accepted, any deviation from it could attract unwanted attention. For a nobleman preparing to enter a political marriage, such attention became dangerous. The bride's family expected reassurance that the groom would present himself as a respectable Christian husband. If whispers suggested that another woman still held influence in his life, those whispers could undermine the confidence required for the alliance to succeed. The church itself rarely intervened directly in private relationships among the nobility. Yet its moral authority shaped how society interpreted those relationships. Public opinion often reflected the values expressed from the pulpit. A household that appeared to ignore those values risked becoming the subject of quiet criticism. This criticism might not appear openly at first. It could emerge as cautious conversation among neighbours, uncertain glances during church services, or subtle changes in how people spoke about the nobleman's household. Over time, these small signs accumulated, creating an atmosphere in which the relationship with a mistress became increasingly difficult to justify. For families negotiating a marriage alliance, such an atmosphere created unnecessary risk. They preferred a situation in which the groom's reputation remained entirely clear. A lawful marriage should appear clean, orderly, and free from lingering complications. The moral authority of the church reinforced this expectation, reminding everyone that marriage was meant to stand above temptation and disorder. In practical terms, this meant that the nobleman faced pressure from more than just relatives and advisors. The entire moral climate surrounding him encouraged the same decision. Sermons warned against divided loyalties. Gossip reminded him that others were watching. The church's emphasis on purity within marriage gradually turned his private relationship into a visible problem. The mistress herself might feel the consequences of this shift. Neighbours who once treated her politely might begin to withdraw. Invitations became less frequent. Even casual encounters carried a sense of unease, as if the community had begun to question her place within its moral boundaries. These reactions did not require official condemnation. They emerged naturally from a society shaped by religious expectations. In such a world, maintaining a mistress while preparing for a respectable marriage appeared increasingly incompatible. The alliance demanded a public image that aligned with the church's teachings about lawful union and moral discipline. Gradually, the conclusion became unavoidable. If the marriage was to represent stability and virtue, the relationship outside that marriage could not remain visible. The church did not need to issue direct commands for its influence to shape the decisions of noble households. Through sermons, expectations, and quiet public judgment, it defined the moral boundaries surrounding marriage. Within those boundaries, a mistress became not only a private complication but a visible threat to the appearance of virtue. The negotiations surrounding a noble marriage in Tudor England rarely involved only the groom and his relatives. The family of the future bride observed the situation with equal care, aware that their daughter's reputation and security depended heavily on the character of the man she was about to marry. For them, the alliance represented not only an opportunity, but also a risk. When a marriage contract approached its final stages, the bride's family expected reassurance that the household their daughter would enter was stable and respectable. They had spent years protecting her reputation, guiding her behavior, and preparing her for a role that required discipline and dignity. Allowing her to marry into a situation clouded by unresolved attachments would undermine that effort. Because of this, the groom's past became an important subject of discussion. Families rarely asked blunt questions in public, yet careful inquiries often occurred during private meetings. Relatives and advisors wanted to know whether any previous relationships might threaten the future harmony of the marriage. Even rumours carried weight, because reputation within Tudor society depended as much on perception as on fact. If it became known that the nobleman maintained a mistress, the bride's family could not ignore the issue. Their concern was not simply jealousy or moral disapproval. A visible relationship outside marriage suggested instability within the household. It raised the possibility that the bride might begin her married life under the shadow of gossip or divided loyalties. Such circumstances could damage the alliance before it even began. For this reason, many marriage negotiations quietly included a condition that was never written into the contract itself. Before the wedding could proceed, the groom needed to resolve every lingering connection that might complicate the union. This expectation often appeared in the form of polite but unmistakable language. The bride's relatives might speak about the importance of entering marriage without distraction. They might mention the value of mutual trust between husband and wife, These comments sounded courteous on the surface, yet everyone present understood the message beneath them. The groom was expected to end any prior attachments. The future bride herself sometimes expressed this expectation more directly. Although young women in Tudor society rarely held formal authority within negotiations, their opinions still mattered to their families. A bride who feared humiliation after marriage might insist on assurances before agreeing to the alliance. Her request did not necessarily come from anger. Instead, it reflected a practical understanding of the social environment she would enter. A noblewoman needed to command respect within her household. If another woman remained closely connected to her husband, that respect could weaken immediately. For the bride, therefore, the issue involved dignity as much as emotion. She might ask whether the relationship had truly ended. She might expect the nobleman to demonstrate that he had chosen the marriage without hesitation. In some cases, she might require evidence that the former attachment would no longer influence his life. These expectations placed the nobleman in a delicate position. Until this point, the relationship with his mistress might have remained a private matter. It existed outside the official negotiations and rarely interfered with family strategy. Once the bride's family raised their concerns, however, the situation moved into the center of attention. Silence was no longer sufficient. The groom now needed to prove that his loyalty belonged entirely to the future marriage. This proof could take several forms. He might confirm that he had ended the relationship. He might arrange financial support that would allow the woman to live elsewhere. In some cases, he might even provide written assurances that the connection would never return. Each gesture served the same purpose. It demonstrated that the past had been settled. The bride's family watched these developments carefully. Their willingness to proceed with the marriage depended on confidence that the household would remain free from scandal. Once they felt satisfied, the negotiations could continue toward the final agreement. For the mistress, however, these decisions carried a different meaning. What had once been a private relationship now stood in direct conflict with the alliance being formed. The nobleman could not reassure his future wife, while maintaining visible ties to another woman. The situation demanded a clear resolution. The mistress, therefore, became part of a quiet transition taking place around the household. Her connection to the nobleman belonged to an earlier chapter of his life. The marriage negotiations represented a new chapter defined by legitimacy, reputation, and family strategy. Only one of these chapters could continue. As the wedding approached, the expectations surrounding the groom grew stricter. The bride's family wanted certainty. The church expected moral discipline. The nobleman himself understood that his household was about to change permanently. Within this atmosphere, the request to erase the past no longer sounded unreasonable. It appeared necessary for the success of the alliance. A political marriage demanded more than vows spoken before a priest. It required the complete loyalty of the man entering the union. The bride and her family needed proof that the household would begin its future free from lingering attachments. Somewhere beyond the negotiations and promises, a woman connected to the groom's past was about to learn that her place in his life had quietly ended. The disappearance of a person from a Tudor noble household rarely occurred through open confrontation. There were no loud accusations echoing through the halls. No dramatic scenes played out before servants or guests. Instead, the change unfolded quietly, almost politely, as if the household itself had decided to move forward while leaving certain memories behind. In the great halls, where guests once gathered for evening meals, the absence might first appear subtle. A chair that had once been placed along the table no longer needed to be prepared. Servants who had grown accustomed to setting an extra place simply stopped doing so. The change required no explanation. Within the rhythm of household routines, silence carried its own instructions. For those who attended the dinners regularly, the absence did not go unnoticed. Only weeks earlier, the woman had been present at these gatherings. She might have spoken softly with a few guests, exchanged polite greetings with the steward, or sat quietly while the household discussed news from the court. Her presence had never been officially acknowledged, yet everyone knew she belonged to the private world surrounding the nobleman. Now that presence had vanished. The guests who arrived for supper rarely mentioned the change aloud. Tudor society valued discretion, especially when matters touched upon delicate relationships. Instead of asking questions, visitors simply accepted the altered arrangement. The nobleman himself maintained the same calm demeanor during these evenings. He greeted guests, listened to conversation, and allowed the household routine to continue without interruption. If anyone wondered about the missing figure who once appeared beside him, they quickly learned that curiosity brought little reward. The household behaved as though nothing unusual had happened. Beyond the dining hall, the change extended to other spaces as well. Invitations that once travelled between neighbouring estates no longer carried her name. When gatherings were planned at nearby manors or country houses, the messengers delivered lists of guests that omitted her entirely. The absence required no formal announcement. People simply stopped expecting her arrival. In Tudor society, invitations represented recognition. To be welcomed at another household meant that one's presence was accepted within that social circle. When invitations ceased, the message became unmistakable. The woman had been removed from the network that once surrounded the nobleman. For the mistress herself, the shift often appeared gradually. A letter that once arrived each week might not appear at all. Servants who had carried messages between households suddenly found themselves occupied with other duties. The quiet flow of communication slowly dried up. No one spoke directly about the reason, yet the meaning was clear. The nobleman's household was preparing for a new chapter, and that chapter no longer included her presence. Every small change within the routine of social life confirmed the same reality. Even within the corridors of the estate, the atmosphere began to shift. Servants who had once greeted her with familiarity now behaved with cautious distance. Conversations became brief and formal. People moved quickly through the rooms, avoiding unnecessary interaction. These gestures were not acts of hostility. They reflected the instinct of a household adjusting to new expectations. When a marriage alliance approached, everyone understood that appearances mattered more than personal sentiment. The nobleman's future wife would soon enter the household as its lawful mistress. Her authority required a clear and uncontested position. Any reminder of a previous attachment threatened that clarity. Removing the mistress from public view, therefore, became an essential step. The process unfolded without ceremony. There was no farewell gathering, no public acknowledgement of the years she might have spent near the household's centre. Instead, the transition occurred through absence. The halls remained full of conversation. The dinners continued with music and candlelight. The estate carried on with its ordinary rhythm. Yet one name no longer echoed through those rooms. Within the careful order of Tudor society, this silence carried meaning. It signalled that the household had reorganised itself according to new priorities. The alliance being formed through marriage demanded a fresh beginning. For the nobleman, this change allowed him to present a respectable image to the family he was about to join. Guests visiting the estate saw a household free from visible complications. The past appeared neatly contained behind closed doors. For the woman whose name had once been spoken there, the silence represented something very different. Her connection to the household had not ended through argument or public judgment. It had simply dissolved into the quiet routines of a society determined to preserve order. Over time, even the servants who remembered her presence spoke of her less frequently. The memory of her place within the household faded. Replaced by the new authority of the lawful wife, the great hall continued to host guests, celebrations, and conversations about the future. But the past remained carefully unmentioned. A household preparing for a powerful marriage did not always remove its complications through conflict. Sometimes the transformation occurred through something far quieter, the gradual disappearance of a familiar name. Within the bright rooms of the estate, the silence surrounding that absence carried the final meaning of a relationship that had quietly ended. When a noble household in Tudor England decided that a private relationship could no longer continue. The matter rarely ended with simple dismissal. Even in situations where the mistress possessed no legal protection, the people managing the household understood that abrupt cruelty could create unnecessary problems. A woman who felt humiliated or abandoned might become a source of rumor, resentment, or even scandal. For this reason, many separations were handled through quiet financial arrangements. These arrangements did not appear in formal marriage contracts, yet they formed a practical part of aristocratic life. The goal was not generosity alone. The goal was stability. By providing a modest settlement, the nobleman ensured that the woman could leave the household without creating public conflict. The simplest form of settlement often involved money. A sum might be offered large enough to support her for a period of time, especially if the relationship had lasted several years. Compared with the wealth controlled by a noble estate, such payments were often relatively small. Yet for the woman receiving them, the amount could represent the difference between security and hardship. Sometimes the settlement included more than money. In certain cases, the nobleman might provide a small piece of land or a cottage located some distance from the main estate. These properties rarely carried great value, but they offered something important: independence. A woman who possessed even a modest house could rebuild her life more easily than one forced to begin again without resources. The arrangement served both sides. The nobleman demonstrated that he had acted with a degree of fairness. The woman gained a practical foundation from which she could move forward. More importantly, the separation remained quiet, beyond money and property. Another possibility sometimes appeared. Families occasionally arranged a marriage for the former mistress with a man of lower social rank. Such arrangements could involve a steward, a minor landholder, or a professional connected to the estate. The marriage provided the woman with a respectable place in society, while removing her from the delicate political environment surrounding the noble household. For the nobleman, the advantage was clear. Once the woman entered a new marriage, her connection to his past effectively disappeared. She no longer existed within the circle of gossip that might surround the estate. Her future became tied to another household entirely. These solutions did not arise from romance. They emerged from careful calculation. Tudor aristocratic families understood that reputation depended heavily on controlling information. A disgruntled former mistress might speak freely about private conversations or secrets that could embarrass the household. Preventing such situations required diplomacy rather than confrontation. The financial settlement, therefore, carried an unspoken condition: silence. The woman receiving the payment understood the expectation without needing it written into any document. The arrangement offered her a chance to rebuild her life, but it also marked the final boundary of her connection to the nobleman. Speaking openly about the past could jeopardize the support she had just received. In many cases, the agreement was reached through quiet negotiation. Trusted servants or intermediaries sometimes delivered the offer. They explained the terms gently, emphasizing that the nobleman wished to ensure her comfort, even as circumstances changed. The language remained courteous, avoiding any suggestion of accusation or blame. Yet beneath that politeness lay a firm conclusion. The relationship had ended. For the mistress, accepting the arrangement often represented the most practical choice. Tudor society offered limited opportunities for women who lacked family protection or property. Refusing the settlement could leave her vulnerable to poverty or social isolation. Accepting it allowed her to begin again under safer conditions. The transition itself remained deliberately quiet. She might leave the house she once occupied within a few days or weeks. Servants packed belongings, arranged transport, and ensured that the departure attracted little attention. Neighbours noticed only that she no longer appeared. Within the nobleman's household, the shift allowed preparations for the upcoming marriage to continue without interruption. The estate moved steadily toward its new alliance, free from the visible traces of the earlier relationship. Guests arriving for celebrations would see only a household in perfect order. They would not see the financial arrangements that had quietly reshaped its past. For the nobleman, the settlement resolved a delicate problem with minimal disturbance. For the woman leaving his life, it provided the means to create a different future. The agreement achieved what Tudor society valued most: discretion. The past did not disappear entirely, but it became contained within the silence surrounding the arrangement. In Tudor households, the end of a private relationship often unfolded not through anger but through careful negotiation. A modest settlement could transform a potentially dangerous separation into a quiet departure. Behind that generosity, however, stood a simple expectation that the past would remain unspoken forever. Not every separation between a nobleman and his mistress ended with a peaceful arrangement and a modest settlement. In some households, the situation required stronger action, especially when the presence of the woman threatened to attract attention within the royal court or among influential families. When discretion alone could no longer protect the reputation of the nobleman, removal became the safest solution. This removal rarely appeared dramatic in public. Instead, it took the form of relocation. The woman who had once lived near the center of the household might suddenly find herself sent far from the environment where the relationship had begun. Distance became a practical tool for preventing gossip and restoring order. Once she left the circles where her presence had been known, the memory of the relationship could fade more easily. One common destination was the countryside. A small property in a distant village allowed the woman to live quietly while remaining far removed from the political atmosphere surrounding the noble estate. The house might be modest, sometimes little more than a cottage surrounded by farmland. Compared with the comfort she had once known, the change could feel abrupt. Yet the location served an important purpose. Rural isolation, limited contact with the social networks that connected noble households. Neighbours in distant villages rarely possessed detailed knowledge of aristocratic affairs. Within such surroundings, the woman could rebuild her life without constant reminders of her previous position. For the household she had left behind, the arrangement offered reassurance. Visitors arriving at the estate no longer encountered the woman who had once been associated with the nobleman's private life. Servants continued their duties without the tension that accompanied divided loyalties. The household appeared calm and respectable once more. In other cases, a different path was chosen. Some women were sent to religious institutions, particularly convents or houses connected to charitable orders. These environments provided shelter and basic support while removing the woman completely from public society. Within the quiet walls of a convent, daily life revolved around prayer, odd discipline, and routine rather than social gatherings or courtly influence. The transition could be difficult. A woman who had spent years living near aristocratic privilege might struggle to adapt to the simplicity of religious life. Yet the arrangement satisfied several expectations at once. It protected the woman from poverty, removed her from political circles, and reassured observers that the household had restored moral order. For families concerned about reputation, this outcome carried a certain symbolic value. Placing the former mistress in a religious setting suggested repentance and discipline. Even if the decision had little to do with personal faith, the appearance of moral correction strengthened the public image of the nobleman preparing for marriage. Another solution involved arranging a marriage for the woman with a man of a lower rank. Such marriages rarely attracted attention within aristocratic society. The groom might be a minor landholder, a steward connected to the estate, or a merchant with practical ambitions rather than political influence. By entering this new household, the woman's connection to the nobleman faded into the background. The marriage provided her with a socially recognized role. At the same time, it removed her from the delicate environment where her presence had once carried meaning. Once she belonged to another household, the past relationship became difficult for outsiders to discuss openly. These arrangements reflected the careful calculations of Tudor society. Aristocratic families understood that reputation required more than simply ending a private attachment. The consequences of that attachment had to be managed in ways that prevented further attention, whether through relocation, religious seclusion, or a new marriage. The goal remained the same. Distance created silence. Silence protected the household. The woman herself often possessed little influence over which path was chosen. Decisions emerged from conversations between the nobleman, his relatives, and advisors who focused on preserving stability. Their primary concern was the future alliance being prepared through marriage. Personal sentiment rarely guided the outcome. What mattered was ensuring that the nobleman's household appeared orderly and respectable when the wedding finally took place. Guests arriving for the celebration should encounter no visible traces of past complications. Once the woman had departed for her new life, the transformation became almost immediate. Her name disappeared from conversation. Rooms she once occupied were reassigned. Servants adjusted their routines as though the earlier arrangement had never existed. Within weeks, the household returned to its familiar rhythm. Visitors who had not known the situation closely might never suspect that the estate had recently undergone such a careful reorganization. The alliance moved forward, supported by the quiet removal of a relationship that no longer fit the structure of noble life. Distance often became the simplest method for restoring order within a Tudor household. By sending a former mistress far from the estate, families ensured that the approaching marriage remained free from visible complications. Beyond the reach of the great halls and courtly gatherings, the woman's life continued in a place where her past connections slowly faded from memory. After the woman had been removed from the nobleman's immediate life, the household still faced another challenge. Physical distance alone did not guarantee silence. Tudor society functioned through constant conversation, and information travelled quickly through servants, visitors, and neighbouring estates. Even a relationship that had ended quietly could continue to exist through rumour. For this reason, the period following the separation required careful attention. The first step usually involved the servants. Servants occupied a unique position within aristocratic households. They moved freely through kitchens, corridors, gardens, and guest chambers, observing nearly everything that occurred within the estate. While they rarely spoke openly before their employers, their conversations with one another could spread details far beyond the household walls. Because of this, senior members of the household often addressed the servants directly once the relationship ended. The message did not need to be harsh. It simply reminded them that discretion formed an essential part of their duty. Loyal service included protecting the reputation of the household. Speaking carelessly about private matters could damage that reputation and threaten the stability of everyone who depended on the estate for employment. Most servants understood the warning immediately. Their livelihood relied on maintaining the trust of their employer. Gossip that travelled beyond the household could bring serious consequences. As a result, the woman's name slowly disappeared from conversations within the kitchens and servants' quarters. Even casual remarks about her former presence became rare. The second concern involved written correspondence. Letters played an important role in Tudor communication. Messages passed regularly between estates, relatives, and friends connected through complex social networks. When the mistress remained close to the nobleman, letters may have carried invitations, personal notes, or simple exchanges of news. After the relationship ended, these letters became potential sources of embarrassment. Household stewards or trusted advisors sometimes gathered any remaining correspondence that referred to the woman. Such documents might be destroyed, sealed away, or returned discreetly to their original writers. The goal was not necessarily to erase history, but to prevent written evidence from circulating among curious observers. In an age when reputation depended heavily on perception, a single letter discovered by the wrong person could revive an unwanted story. Controlling written communication, therefore, became another quiet responsibility within the household. The final element involved the wider circle of acquaintances, friends, neighbours, and visitors who had previously encountered the woman understood the situation through subtle signals. Invitations no longer included her name. Conversations shifted quickly whenever the subject approached her absence. Those who possessed good social instincts recognized the change and adapted their behavior accordingly. In aristocratic society, discretion was often expressed through silence rather than direct instruction. A guest who valued continued friendship with the noble household avoided mentioning subjects that created discomfort. Over time, the woman's name faded from polite conversation. Even people who remembered her presence chose to behave as though the connection had never existed. This quiet agreement helped protect everyone involved. The nobleman preserved his reputation as he prepared for marriage. The bride's family encountered no lingering rumors that might weaken their confidence in the alliance. The household itself appeared stable and orderly to those observing from outside. For the woman who had once lived close to the estate, this silence carried a different meaning. Her departure had not been announced publicly, yet the careful management of conversation ensured that her memory slowly disappeared from the environment where it had once mattered. The absence of discussion made the past difficult to recover. Over time, even those who had known the situation well stopped referring to it. The estate moved forward with its preparations for the marriage alliance. Servants returned their attention to daily duties. Visitors arrived to discuss land, politics, or court news without encountering uncomfortable reminders of the earlier relationship. Within a few months, the household atmosphere could appear completely unchanged. Only a small number of people remembered how recently the arrangement had existed, even though they rarely spoke of it. Recognizing that the subject now belonged to a chapter of the nobleman's life that polite society preferred to leave behind. This quiet control of rumor reflected a broader truth about Tudor aristocratic culture. Reputation was not preserved solely through laws or punishments. It survived through shared understanding. When influential families wished a subject to disappear, silence often proved more effective than confrontation. Servants, friends, and advisors all played their part in maintaining that silence. Together, they ensured that the approaching marriage would proceed without the shadow of unnecessary gossip. Removing the woman from the household ended the relationship, but controlling the story surrounding that ending required equal care. Servants guarded their words. Letters vanished from circulation, and friends learned to avoid mentioning her name. Within that carefully maintained silence, the past slowly lost its voice. Within the great households of Tudor England, not every ending required noise. Many conflicts that might have produced open accusations in other circumstances were resolved through far quieter means. The aristocratic world preferred order over spectacle, and maintaining that order often depended on controlling how problems disappeared rather than how they were punished. When a private relationship became inconvenient, the goal was rarely to expose wrongdoing. Exposure created attention, and attention threatened reputation. Noble families understood that scandal could travel quickly across counties and court circles, damaging alliances that had taken years to construct. Silence, therefore, offered a safer solution. Unlike crimes that required judgment in court, the presence of a mistress existed outside formal legal structures. No law demanded public investigation. No official record needed to be created. Without legal recognition, the relationship could also end without a legal procedure. This absence of formality allowed the household to resolve the matter quietly. There were no trials in crowded halls, where witnesses repeated stories before curious audiences. No officials summoned the nobleman to defend his private conduct. The law intervened only when property, inheritance, or public disorder demanded attention. A mistress represented none of these things. She existed in a private world that society tolerated as long as it remained discreet. When circumstances changed, and discretion was no longer sufficient, the relationship could simply be removed from the household's daily life. The process often unfolded through small decisions rather than dramatic announcements. A carriage might arrive one morning to carry the woman away from the estate. Servants might pack her belongings carefully and send them to a new residence arranged elsewhere. Rooms she once occupied would be reassigned within days. No public explanation accompanied these changes. Guests visiting the household noticed only that the woman who once appeared beside the nobleman no longer attended gatherings. The great hall remained lively, with conversation and music. Dinners continued under candlelight. The estate's routine moved forward as if nothing had altered. In this way, the absence gradually replaced the presence. The nobleman himself rarely spoke publicly about the separation. Discussing the matter would invite unnecessary curiosity. Instead, he focused on the future alliance that justified the change. Conversations with relatives centered on wedding preparations, property arrangements, and plans for the household's new structure. Visitors naturally turned their attention toward the coming marriage. Within a short time, the household's narrative adjusted itself. Servants spoke of the bride who would soon arrive. Relatives discussed the advantages of the alliance. Even neighbors began to associate the estate with its approaching celebration rather than with the private relationship that had recently ended. The woman's disappearance, therefore, required no formal announcement. Her absence itself served as the final statement. For the mistress, the transition could feel abrupt. One day, she belonged to the quiet inner circle of the nobleman's life. The next day, she found herself living somewhere else, separated from the environment that had once defined her routine. Yet even this abruptness followed the logic of Tudor society. Aristocratic households depended on stability. Once a marriage alliance began to reshape the future of the estate, anything that threatened that stability needed to be removed quickly and quietly. Delay invited gossip. Explanation invited curiosity. Silence solved both problems. Over time, the household adjusted completely to the new order. The future bride took her place at the center of the estate's life. Servants transferred their loyalty to the lawful mistress of the house. Guests who attended gatherings saw nothing that contradicted the image of respectability the family wished to present. The past relationship slowly dissolved into memory. Only a handful of people who had witnessed the earlier arrangement retained a clear recollection of how abruptly the change had occurred, even though they rarely spoke about it. Understanding that the household now preferred to move forward without revisiting the subject. Within the carefully controlled world of Tudor nobility, disappearance often proved more effective than confrontation. A trial might produce testimony, records, and lingering questions. Silence produced none of these things. The household simply closed one chapter of its story and began another. The great halls remained full of light and conversation. The wedding preparations continued without interruption, and the woman who once occupied a place within that world became part of a past that polite society chose not to remember. In Tudor households, ending a relationship did not always require accusation or public conflict. A quiet departure could remove a complication more effectively than any formal judgment. Sometimes the only sign that a life had changed forever was the silent closing of a door. The disappearance from a noble household did not end with the physical act of leaving the estate. For the woman who had once lived close to the center of aristocratic life, the departure often marked the beginning of a deeper and more difficult transformation. What changed was not only her location, but her entire place within society. In Tudor England, social identity depended heavily on recognition. A person's status was reflected through invitations, greetings, and the simple act of being acknowledged within certain circles. When the mistress lived near the nobleman's household, she occupied a small but visible place within this system. Even if her role remained unofficial, people still recognized her presence. Servants addressed her with courtesy. Visitors knew her name. Neighbors understood that she belonged to the private world surrounding the estate. Once the relationship ended, that recognition disappeared quickly. The loss of social position could be felt almost immediately. Invitations stopped arriving. Conversations that once welcomed her presence became distant or cautious. In some cases, acquaintances avoided meeting her entirely, uncertain how to behave now that her connection to the nobleman had ended. The absence of recognition created a quiet isolation. Within a society that valued hierarchy so strongly, being removed from a known position meant drifting into uncertainty. The woman who once moved through certain spaces with confidence now found herself outside those familiar boundaries. Daily life changed in small but significant ways. Places that once felt accessible suddenly seemed uncomfortable to visit. The gatherings where she had once been welcomed now belonged to another social world. Even passing through towns near the estate might attract curious glances from people who remembered her former association with the household. For many women, this loss of social standing carried a deep emotional impact. The mistress had often built her identity around the relationship itself. Her home, her routine, and her network of acquaintances all grew from that connection. When the relationship ended, these structures collapsed simultaneously. Financial security often vanished as well. Even when a settlement had been provided, it rarely matched the level of comfort she had known before. The allowance that once supported her household stopped arriving regularly. Servants, who once attended her, returned to other duties. Maintaining the lifestyle she had grown accustomed to became difficult or impossible. This financial shift reinforced the emotional consequences. The woman not only lost her place in society, but also the resources that had sustained her daily life. Every change reminded her that the position she once occupied had depended entirely on another person's favor. Reputation added another layer to this transformation. Although the separation itself might have occurred quietly, the memory of the relationship could linger within the community. Some people remembered her as the nobleman's former companion. Others viewed her situation with curiosity or moral judgment. In Tudor society, reputation could shape how easily a person rebuilt their life. A woman whose past connection to a nobleman remained widely known might struggle to regain the same level of respect she once enjoyed, even if she lived quietly and avoided attention. The story of her earlier life could follow her through conversations she never heard directly. This awareness created a particular form of psychological burden. The mistress understood that her identity had once been tied to someone else's status. Now she needed to construct a new identity without that connection. The process required patience and resilience, especially in a society that offered limited independence to women. Some women adapted gradually. They focused on building quieter lives in new locations, forming friendships with people who knew little about their past. Others relied on relatives or distant acquaintances for support as they adjusted to different circumstances. Yet the memory of their earlier position rarely disappeared completely. The contrast between the life they once lived and the life they now faced remained vivid. Rooms that once held conversation and warmth were replaced by smaller homes and quieter routines. The change could feel not only practical but deeply personal. In many ways, the psychological impact extended far beyond the moment of separation. The nobleman, who had ended the relationship, continued forward into marriage and political alliances. His household regained stability, and his reputation remained protected. The woman, however, carried the emotional consequences of that decision long after the estate had forgotten her presence. Her departure had solved a problem for the household. For her, it marked the beginning of an uncertain future. Over time, the routines of daily life might soften the sharpness of the loss. New relationships could form. New habits replaced old ones. Yet the awareness of how suddenly her position had vanished remained difficult to ignore. The experience revealed the fragile nature of status within Tudor society. Comfort, recognition, and influence could appear secure for years. Yet they could disappear the moment the political or social priorities of a household changed. Leaving the nobleman's household meant far more than a change of residence for the woman who had once lived there. The disappearance removed her from the social world that had defined her daily life and her sense of belonging. In the quiet aftermath of that departure, she faced the difficult task of rebuilding an identity without the power that had once surrounded her. Once the former relationship had been removed from his life, The nobleman entered a new stage in the careful management of his public reputation. Tudor society observed the behaviour of aristocratic figures closely, especially when a marriage alliance approached. Every gesture, every appearance, and every word spoken in public could reinforce or weaken the image he now needed to present. The transformation often began with visibility. Where the nobleman had once moved quietly through certain social spaces, he now appeared openly beside his future bride. Public gatherings, estate visits, and religious services offered opportunities to display the unity forming between the two families. Guests who attended these events noticed the change immediately. The bride stood at his side. Their presence together signaled stability and respectability. In Tudor society, appearances carried powerful meaning. A nobleman who walked confidently beside his future wife demonstrated that his household had entered a new and legitimate phase. Relatives from both families encouraged these appearances. They understood that a visible partnership helped erase any lingering doubts about the groom's past attachments. The more frequently the couple appeared together in respectable settings, the more firmly their alliance became established in the minds of those observing them. Church services played an important role in this process. Attending religious ceremonies alongside his future wife allowed the nobleman to present himself as a man guided by moral discipline. Within the walls of the parish church, surrounded by neighbours and tenants, the couple's presence suggested harmony and commitment to the values expected of Christian marriage. The symbolism was difficult to miss. The same society that had once whispered about his private relationship now saw him standing beside a lawful bride beneath the authority of the church. The transformation reinforced the idea that he had returned fully to the moral order that governed aristocratic life. Words also contributed to the reconstruction of his reputation. In conversations with relatives, advisors, and guests, the nobleman often spoke about the future rather than the past. He described the responsibilities of marriage, the importance of loyalty, and the stability that the alliance would bring to the household. These statements did not require elaborate declarations. Even simple expressions of commitment carried weight within Tudor society. When the nobleman spoke of honouring his future wife or protecting the interests of their combined families, listeners heard confirmation that he had embraced his new role fully. Over time, these messages shaped how others interpreted his character. People who might once have remembered his earlier relationship began to view him through a different lens. Instead of a man with private complications, he appeared as a responsible figure preparing to lead a respectable household. The transformation was not accidental. Relatives and advisors often guided the nobleman through this process carefully. They encouraged him to participate in gatherings where his conduct could be observed. They arranged meetings between the two families that highlighted cooperation and goodwill. Each event reinforced the same narrative. The household had moved forward. The coming marriage represented a fresh beginning. The nobleman's image gradually aligned with the expectations placed upon him by both society and family. Where there had once been whispers of uncertainty, there now appeared a picture of stability and discipline. Even the structure of daily life began to reflect this change. Preparations for the wedding filled the household with activity. Servants arranged decorations. Stewards organized supplies. And relatives discussed plans for the celebration. The estate itself seemed to revolve around the approaching union. Within this atmosphere, the nobleman's earlier life faded further into the background. Visitors who arrived during this period rarely spoke of the past. Their attention centered on the future bride and the alliance her presence represented. The household story had shifted from quiet controversy to public respectability. For the nobleman, this reconstruction of reputation served an important purpose. Marriage did more than unite two individuals. It created a public identity for the couple that would shape how others viewed their household for years to come. By presenting himself as loyal and disciplined, he reassured both families that the alliance rested on solid ground. The past remained unspoken. The future, however, appeared carefully prepared. In Tudor society, Such reinvention did not require dramatic declarations. It depended instead on repeated gestures that signaled consistency and commitment. Over time, those gestures became accepted as proof that the nobleman had fully embraced his role as husband and head of the household. What had once been private complexity now seemed replaced by public order. The nobleman's public life gradually reshaped itself around the approaching marriage and the expectations that came with it. Standing beside his future wife, he presented an image of loyalty and moral discipline that reassured both families and observers alike. Within this carefully constructed picture of respectability, the past quietly retreated beyond the edges of memory. When a marriage alliance joined two aristocratic families in Tudor England, the union did not end with the ceremony itself. The wedding marked only the beginning of a new arrangement in which both families remained closely connected to the life of the household. The bride entered her husband's estate, not as an isolated individual, but as a representative of her lineage, carrying the expectations and influence of her relatives with her. For the family of the bride, the marriage created a lasting interest in the stability of the new household. They had entrusted their daughter's future to the nobleman, and that decision demanded continued attention. A marriage between powerful families involved property, inheritance, and political reputation. Protecting these interests required vigilance long after the wedding celebrations had ended. Because of this, the bride's relatives often maintained a watchful presence. Brothers, uncles, and trusted advisors visited the estate frequently, sometimes under the appearance of ordinary family courtesy. These visits allowed them to observe the behavior of the groom and the general atmosphere within the household. A nobleman who treated his wife with respect strengthened the alliance between the families. Any sign of neglect or lingering attachment to his former life, however, could raise concern. Observation, therefore, became a quiet responsibility. The visitors rarely announced that they were watching for signs of trouble. Instead, they participated in the routine activities of the household while noting the details that revealed its true condition. They watched how the nobleman spoke to his wife, how servants treated her authority, and how often the couple appeared together in public. Every small detail carried meaning. The bride's relatives also paid careful attention to communication within the estate. Letters formed an essential part of aristocratic life, connecting families across long distances. Through correspondence, news travelled quickly between households. Yet those same letters could also carry messages that revived old relationships. For this reason, the exchange of letters sometimes attracted quiet scrutiny. Stewards, or trusted clerks, who handled the estate's correspondence, ensured that official messages passed through proper channels. While personal letters could not always be controlled entirely, the household remained aware of the possibility that written communication might reconnect the nobleman with people from his past. This awareness did not always require strict intervention. Often, the knowledge that letters might be observed proved sufficient to discourage questionable contact. The nobleman understood that his actions now reflected on both families, not only his own. Writing carelessly could invite suspicion that the marriage alliance had not fully replaced earlier attachments. In addition to monitoring communication, the bride's relatives relied on the presence of loyal servants within the household. Many noble families placed trusted attendants alongside their daughters when they married. These individuals served practical roles in the household while also providing quiet reassurance to the bride's family. Through ordinary conversation and observation, they could report whether the estate remained harmonious. Such arrangements were rarely described openly as surveillance. Instead, they formed part of the normal structure of aristocratic marriage. The household of the bride and the household of the groom gradually blended together, creating a network of relationships that connected both families to the daily life of the estate. Within this network, secrecy became difficult to maintain. If the nobleman attempted to renew contact with his former mistress, even small signs might attract attention. A sudden change in routine, a private journey without explanation, or unusual correspondence could raise questions among those watching carefully. The goal of this vigilance was not punishment. Rather, it served to protect the stability of the alliance. Both families had invested their reputation and property in the marriage. Ensuring that the nobleman remained loyal to his wife preserved the strength of that investment. Over time, this watchful atmosphere shaped the habits of the household itself. The nobleman adjusted to the expectations surrounding him. His behavior became more consistent with the role of a married man whose responsibilities extended beyond personal preference. The presence of relatives and advisors reminded him that the household now represented a shared future between two powerful families. For the bride, this support offered reassurance. Knowing that her relatives remained attentive to the conditions of the marriage allowed her to exercise authority within the estate with greater confidence. She was no longer simply a new arrival, but the central figure around whom the household revolved. The earlier relationship that had once complicated the nobleman's life found little space to return. The environment surrounding the marriage made secrecy difficult and unnecessary. Public appearances, family visits, and the steady exchange of letters all reinforced the expectation that the alliance would remain stable and honourable. Within this carefully observed household, the past gradually lost its ability to influence the present. The marriage alliance joined not only two individuals, but also the watchful attention of two powerful families. Through visits, correspondence, and trusted servants, the bride's relatives ensured that the new household remained faithful to its commitments. Under such careful observation, any shadow from the nobleman's past found little room to return. The marriage alliance that now stood at the centre of the noble household appeared. From the outside, orderly and dignified. Guests arriving at the estate saw preparations for a respectable union. Servants moved quickly through corridors carrying fabrics, letters, and supplies for the coming ceremony. Relatives discussed arrangements for the wedding feast, while stewards calculated the expenses that such celebrations required. Everything suggested harmony. The bride moved through the household with increasing confidence, gradually assuming the position that would soon belong to her permanently. Conversations among visitors focused on the advantages of the alliance and the stability it promised for both families. Land, reputation, and future heirs formed the language through which the marriage was described. Within this carefully organized environment, affection rarely appeared as the central theme. Tudor society viewed marriage primarily as a structure that preserved order. It connected estates, strengthened alliances, and ensured the continuation of family lines. Personal feelings might develop later, but it was never considered the foundation of the arrangement. For the noble families involved, the most important element remained reputation. A marriage alliance between powerful households depended on mutual respect and trust. Each family needed to believe that the other would protect the honor of the union. If doubts arose about loyalty or discipline, the alliance itself could weaken. Because of this, the marriage preparation required more than celebration. It required careful control over the past. The nobleman understood this expectation clearly. His household had already taken steps to remove any visible traces of the earlier relationship that once existed within his private life. The absence of that connection allowed the new alliance to stand without contradiction. Visitors who entered the estate now encountered a different atmosphere. The great hall displayed the symbols of legitimacy, family crests, formal seating arrangements, and the presence of relatives from both sides. The narrative surrounding the nobleman's life focused entirely on the future he was about to build with his bride. No one spoke about the woman who had once occupied a quiet place beside him. This silence was not accidental. It represented a deliberate adjustment within the household. The marriage required a clear beginning, free from reminders of attachments that belonged to an earlier stage of the nobleman's life. For the bride, this transformation carried particular importance. Her authority within the household depended on the recognition that she alone held the position of lawful partner. Any lingering presence from the past could challenge that authority. The disappearance of the mistress, therefore, strengthened the foundation upon which the marriage would stand. From the perspective of the families arranging the alliance, the outcome appeared entirely reasonable. A household preparing for marriage needed stability. The removal of earlier complications ensured that the bride entered her new life without the shadow of divided loyalty. The estate could now present itself as a model of respectability within the surrounding community. Yet the order that now filled the household had been created through an act of erasure. The woman who once shared the nobleman's private life had not committed any crime. She had not stood before a court or faced public accusation. Nevertheless, the structure of aristocratic society left no place for her once the marriage alliance became the priority. Her departure had allowed the household to reorganize itself. Rooms that once held quiet conversations now belonged to the routines of wedding preparation. Servants who had once carried messages between private residences now focused on welcoming the bride's relatives. Even the estate's social circles adjusted quickly, directing their attention toward the future couple. The transformation appeared smooth because the household wished it to appear that way. Behind the order and celebration stood the quiet understanding that a sacrifice had taken place. The stability now admired by visitors required the removal of a relationship that could not be reconciled with the expectations of noble marriage. Within Tudor society, such sacrifices were rarely discussed openly. Marriage demanded loyalty not only between husband and wife, but also between families and their shared ambitions. Protecting that loyalty sometimes required removing individuals whose presence threatened the image of unity the alliance sought to display. In the weeks leading to the wedding, the estate grew busier and more confident. Music rehearsals echoed through the halls. Carriages arrived, carrying relatives and gifts. The nobleman appeared beside his bride with calm assurance, embodying the image of a man prepared to lead a respectable household. The past remained silent behind them. Few of those celebrating the alliance paused to consider the cost of that silence. The marriage, now approaching, promised stability, respectability, and a future shaped by powerful alliances. Within that promise, affection played a smaller role than reputation and the protection of family honor. Somewhere beyond the bright preparations for the wedding, a woman's absence remained the quiet price that made the new beginning possible. The quiet removal of a former mistress did not always unfold as smoothly as the noble household intended. In many cases, the arrangement worked precisely because silence benefited everyone involved. The nobleman secured his future marriage. The families preserved their reputation. And the woman who left the household received a settlement that allowed her to begin a different life. Yet silence was not guaranteed. Some women recognized that their departure did not erase the knowledge they carried with them. A mistress who had spent months or years close to a powerful man had witnessed private conversations, confidential plans, and moments of vulnerability rarely seen by outsiders. These memories possessed a certain value. For a few women, that value became a tool. Rather than accepting their disappearance quietly, they reminded the nobleman that the past could still speak. A letter might arrive containing polite but unmistakable hints about things that should remain private. The message rarely contained direct threats. Instead, it suggested that discretion required continued generosity. In Tudor society, reputation depended heavily on perception. A scandal involving a nobleman shortly before his marriage could damage not only his personal standing, but also the alliance between families. Even rumors, if repeated widely enough, could weaken trust. Because of this risk, the nobleman often preferred negotiation over confrontation. Money, therefore, became one of the most common responses. Additional payments, sometimes disguised as gifts or extended settlements, allowed the former mistress to maintain comfort without drawing attention. These arrangements rarely appeared in official records, yet they served as practical solutions to avoid the danger of public embarrassment. The request for more money did not always arise from greed. For many women, the settlement they had received during their departure proved insufficient once they faced the realities of independent life. Without a permanent position in aristocratic society, maintaining financial stability required careful planning. The knowledge that the noblemen feared scandal gave them leverage they might otherwise lack. However, financial demands represented only one form of resistance. Some women chose a different path entirely by seeking the protection of another patron. Tudor society contained many powerful figures, and relationships between nobles often overlapped through family, politics, and shared social circles. A mistress who had once belonged to one household might quietly appear within another. In these situations, the woman did not present herself as a threat, but as a person deserving sympathy. A new patron might offer residence, employment, or financial support in exchange for companionship or loyalty. Through this arrangement, she secured a measure of protection against complete isolation. This shift carried certain advantages. If the nobleman understood that the woman now enjoyed the protection of another influential figure, he might hesitate to provoke conflict. The delicate balance of aristocratic relationships encouraged restraint. Confrontations between powerful households rarely benefited anyone. For the woman herself, finding a new protector restored a degree of stability. Although her previous life could not be recreated entirely, the presence of another household allowed her to remain within the social world she understood best. Familiar routines returned gradually, attending gatherings, maintaining correspondence, and participating once again in the quiet exchange of influence that shaped aristocratic society. Nevertheless, resistance carried risks. A woman who pushed her demands too aggressively might provoke anger rather than negotiation. Noble families possessed resources and authority that could isolate her socially or legally if they believed she threatened the stability of an important marriage alliance. Because of this, many women balanced their actions carefully. Their letters remained respectful. Their requests appeared reasonable rather than confrontational. Even when reminding the nobleman of what they knew, they framed their words as appeals for fairness rather than attempts at coercion. This cautious approach reflected an understanding of how fragile their position remained. The mistress might possess knowledge capable of causing embarrassment, but she still lacked the protection that legitimate marriage provided. Maintaining a careful tone preserved the possibility of compromise while avoiding open conflict. Within the nobleman's household, these situations often remained hidden from public view. Servants delivered letters quietly. Advisors discussed responses behind closed doors. The approaching marriage continued to appear stable to the outside world, even while private negotiations attempted to resolve lingering complications from the past. Most of these disputes eventually faded into quiet settlements. Money changed hands. New arrangements were established, and the former mistress disappeared once again from the immediate concerns of the household. The marriage alliance proceeded without visible interruption. Yet the existence of such resistance revealed an important truth. The disappearance of a mistress might appear simple from a distance, but the reality involved negotiation, calculation, and the careful management of secrets known only to a few individuals. Not every woman accepted her removal from a noble household without protest. Some used the knowledge they carried to demand compensation or to secure protection from new patrons. Hidden behind the calm surface of aristocratic marriages, quiet struggles continued long after the relationship had officially ended. The stability of a Tudor marriage alliance depended not only on the wedding ceremony, but also on the careful management of everything that came before it. Once the union between two noble families had been announced, the expectations surrounding the groom changed immediately. His personal behavior no longer belonged solely to him. It became part of a larger structure that protected land, inheritance, and reputation. For this reason, any unfinished relationship from the past could become a danger. A former mistress who remained nearby, who continued writing letters, or who appeared again within the nobleman's social circle, created uncertainty around the marriage. Even if nothing improper actually occurred after the wedding, the appearance of continued intimacy could damage the credibility of the alliance. In Tudor society, appearances often carried as much weight as reality, A nobleman accused of maintaining a secret relationship after marriage risked being labelled morally unreliable. Such accusations did not require direct proof to spread. Rumours moved quickly through noble networks, carried by servants, visitors, and relatives who repeated what they had heard. Once a rumour reached the wrong ears, its consequences could multiply. The bride's family, having invested reputation and property in the alliance, might interpret the rumour as a betrayal of trust. For them, the marriage represented more than a personal union. It was a formal agreement that connected two houses through loyalty and honour. If the groom appeared careless about that loyalty, tensions could rise quickly. A lingering connection with a former mistress, therefore, carried risks that extended far beyond private embarrassment. It could weaken the confidence between the two families whose cooperation sustained the marriage. Even small suspicions could reopen negotiations that both sides believed had already been settled. The consequences might begin quietly. Relatives from the bride's family could question the nobleman's behaviour during visits. Letters between households might grow more cautious. Invitations to shared gatherings might become less frequent, while the families reassess the stability of their alliance. In aristocratic society, distance often signalled concern. The absence of warmth between families did not require open conflict to become visible. Observers within the court quickly noticed changes in tone and cooperation. A nobleman whose marriage alliance appeared uncertain might lose influence among those who preferred stable partnerships. Political alliances often depended on trust. When two noble families joined through marriage, they frequently supported one another in matters of land management, legal disputes, and court influence. If doubts about loyalty emerged, that cooperation could weaken or disappear entirely. Such tensions sometimes led to confrontation. The bride's relatives might demand explanations or assurances that the former relationship had truly ended. These conversations rarely occurred publicly, yet their tone could be firm. A nobleman who wished to preserve the alliance needed to demonstrate clearly that his loyalty now belonged to his wife and her family. Failure to provide such reassurance risked deeper conflict. Disagreements between families could escalate into legal disputes over property or inheritance. In extreme cases, the marriage itself might lose the unity that made it politically valuable. What began as a private complication could therefore evolve into a broader struggle between powerful households. For this reason, advisors within noble families emphasized the importance of finality. A relationship from the past needed to end completely before the marriage began. The former mistress had to disappear from the nobleman's life in a way that left no opportunity for rumours to revive the story later. The decision was not always driven by cruelty. From the perspective of the families arranging the marriage, the goal was protection. They wished to ensure that the alliance between their houses remained strong enough to survive the pressures of politics, inheritance, and public scrutiny. Yet achieving that protection required removing anything that might threaten it. The nobleman understood that his future position depended on the success of the alliance. His conduct after marriage would be watched carefully, not only by his wife, but also by the network of relatives connected to her family. Under these circumstances, even a small trace of the earlier relationship could appear dangerous. A letter discovered by the wrong person, a meeting witnessed by a curious servant, or a rumour repeated by an ambitious rival might reopen questions that the marriage was meant to close. For aristocratic households, preventing such risks became essential. Ensuring that the former mistress had disappeared completely from the nobleman's life allowed the marriage alliance to stand without doubt. The absence of uncertainty preserved the cooperation between families that made the union valuable. In this way, the quiet removal of the past protected the fragile stability of the future. A marriage alliance in Tudor society demanded absolute loyalty once the ceremony had taken place. Any lingering connection to a former mistress could create rumours strong enough to damage the trust between two powerful families. To protect the alliance from political danger, the past had to disappear completely before the future could safely begin. In a noble household that carefully erased the memory of a former mistress, one presence could remain impossible to remove completely. A child born outside marriage carried a kind of evidence that no silence could fully hide. While the woman might disappear from the estate and from conversation, the existence of the child quietly preserved the reality of the past. Aristocratic society in Tudor England depended heavily on the certainty of lineage. Land, titles, and political authority moved through families according to strict patterns of inheritance. Each generation relied on the legitimacy of the next. A lawful heir ensured continuity, stability, and the survival of the estate's influence within the wider network of noble alliances. Any uncertainty surrounding bloodlines threatened that stability. A child born outside lawful marriage had no automatic right to inherit property or titles. The legal structure of Tudor society made this distinction clear. Legitimate heirs stood at the centre of inheritance, while other children existed outside the official line. Yet, blood connections still carried meaning. Those within the nobleman's private circle often knew the truth. Servants who had observed the relationship, midwives who attended the birth, or relatives connected to the woman might all understand who the child's father truly was. Knowledge like this did not disappear simply because the household chose silence. Families, therefore, developed quiet methods to contain the situation. Distance often became the first solution. The child rarely remained close to the noble estate, where legitimate heirs were raised and educated. Instead, arrangements were made to place the child elsewhere, usually within a household that could be trusted to maintain discretion. Sometimes the child grew up with relatives from the mother's family. A grandmother, aunt, or cousin might accept the responsibility of raising the child far from the political environment surrounding the nobleman's household. In other cases, loyal retainers or families connected to the estate took on the role quietly. Financial support usually followed these arrangements. Money travelled through indirect channels so that the nobleman could assist without openly acknowledging the connection. Stewards, legal agents, or trusted intermediaries handled these payments carefully. Within estate records, the funds might appear as charitable assistance or household expenses unrelated to inheritance. Through this system, the child received a stable upbringing, clothing, food, education, and sometimes a modest apprenticeship or career opportunity could be provided. The nobleman fulfilled a sense of obligation while protecting the structure of his legitimate family. Despite these precautions, secrecy remained fragile. Over time, small details could circulate through conversation. Servants might notice unusual payments. A letter might contain hints about the child's true origin. The intricate social networks of Tudor England allowed rumours to travel quietly from one household to another. Such rumours did not require proof to create unease. Political rivals, ambitious courtiers, or dissatisfied relatives might find advantage in repeating the story, even when the child possessed no legal claim to inheritance. The suggestion of hidden obligations could weaken the nobleman's authority. Questions about loyalty could emerge. Observers might wonder whether the nobleman felt divided responsibilities between his lawful family and the child from his earlier relationship. In a society that valued discipline and moral reputation, such doubts carried weight. Families, therefore, worked carefully to prevent the child from appearing as a threat to legitimate heirs. Public recognition of inheritance always focused on the lawful children born within marriage. Portrait, education, and public appearances reinforced their role as the unquestioned future of the estate. Meanwhile, the other child remained outside that visible structure. Support continued quietly, but acknowledgement did not. The child's name rarely appeared in documents connected to the estate. Guests visiting the noble household heard nothing about this part of the family's history. For the nobleman himself, the situation often involved personal conflict. A sense of responsibility toward the child might exist alongside the need to protect the stability of his marriage and the inheritance line. Public recognition of the child could create confusion about succession and damage the alliances that supported his position. Many men, therefore, maintain distance while continuing financial assistance. Direct contact might remain rare. Gifts or letters could travel through trusted servants or agents who ensured the connection remained private. Inside the noble household, silence protected the marriage alliance. The wife and her relatives typically avoided discussing the child openly. Addressing the matter directly could revive questions that the marriage had been designed to close. By leaving the subject unspoken, the family preserved the image of order surrounding the household. Years could pass under this arrangement. The legitimate heirs grew into adulthood, preparing to inherit the estate and continue the family's influence. Beyond the estate walls, another life developed quietly in the background. That life carried the memory of a past that the household had chosen not to acknowledge. A child born outside marriage complicated the carefully controlled system of Tudor inheritance. Families concealed the child from the public structure of the household while continuing to provide quiet support. Hidden beyond the estate's walls, that life remained a silent reminder that the past could never disappear entirely. A noble household could reorganize itself with remarkable efficiency once a marriage alliance had been secured. Rooms were reassigned, routines changed, and the social rhythm of the estate adjusted to reflect the new reality. Guests arriving for dinners or negotiations encountered an environment that appeared calm and disciplined. Servants carried out their duties as though nothing unusual had ever taken place within those walls. Yet the past did not always disappear as completely as the household hoped. A child born outside marriage carried a truth that could not be erased through silence or distance. Even when raised far away from the estate, that child represented a living connection to events that the noble family preferred to forget. Blood, unlike reputation, could not be rewritten simply through careful management of appearances. In Tudor society, lineage defined stability. Families measured their strength through inheritance and the clear transmission of titles, land, and authority. The birth of a legitimate heir secured the future of the estate. Portraits displayed in the Great Hall celebrated this continuity, presenting an unbroken line of ancestry that appeared orderly and unquestioned. An illegitimate child did not belong within that carefully arranged picture. Legal customs excluded such children from the direct line of inheritance. The estate's wealth and authority remained reserved for heirs born within lawful marriage. Nevertheless, the biological connection between father and child still existed, and those who knew the truth understood its significance. Because of this, aristocratic families relied on distance. The child usually grew up far from the noble estate, raised by guardians who could maintain discretion. A grandmother, an aunt, or a loyal family member connected to the household might assume responsibility for daily care. These guardians protected while ensuring that the child's identity remained hidden from the public world surrounding the nobleman. Financial support often travelled quietly through intermediaries. A steward might deliver funds under the description of charitable assistance or educational expenses. In the records of the estate, these payments appeared ordinary, revealing nothing about the relationship that had created them. Through such arrangements, the child lived safely without disturbing the structure of the noble household. Food, clothing, and education were provided. The nobleman fulfilled a private obligation while preserving the legitimacy of the heirs who would inherit his estate. Yet secrecy rarely remained perfect. Servants observed patterns. Letters moved between distant households. A guardian might reveal fragments of the story through careless conversation. Over time, these fragments could form a quiet narrative that circulated among those who paid close attention to aristocratic life. Rumors rarely needed confirmation to carry influence. A political rival or ambitious courtier might revive the story if it served their interests. Even if the child possessed no legal claim to inheritance, The existence of that connection could raise questions about loyalty and discipline within the noble household. For a man who relied on reputation to maintain alliances, such questions could become dangerous. Marriage alliances linked families through trust. If whispers suggested that the nobleman still carried obligations or secrets tied to his past, the stability of that alliance might appear less certain. Because of this possibility, the household maintained strict silence. The wife and her relatives avoided discussing the child directly. Servants understood that curiosity about the subject could threaten their position. Visitors heard nothing about the life that existed beyond the estate's boundaries. Within the great hall, the narrative remained simple. Legitimate heirs represented the future. The nobleman stood beside his wife as the head of a respectable household. Portraits, ceremonies, and alliances reinforced the image of order. Beyond that carefully controlled image lived a different reality. The child grew older, carrying the same blood that flowed through the nobleman's legitimate heirs. Even if the connection remained hidden, the truth existed within the child's identity. Time did not weaken that connection. Years might pass without incident. The noble household prospered. Heirs matured, and alliances strengthened through marriage. Observers believed the past had vanished completely, but blood possessed a stubborn permanence. A person whose very existence preserved the memory of an earlier relationship could not be erased through silence alone. The household might control its reputation, yet the biological truth remained alive somewhere beyond its walls. A mistress could disappear from a noble household, and her name could fade from conversation. A child, however, carried a living connection that distance and secrecy could never fully erase. Long after the estate believed the past had been buried, that quiet existence still held the power to bring forgotten truths back into view. Records from Tudor England often appeared detailed and orderly. Noble families preserved letters, legal documents, and property records with great care. Historians today can follow marriages, inheritances, and alliances through these surviving papers. Names of wives appear clearly beside the names of their husbands. Births of legitimate heirs are written into family histories and parish registers with careful precision. Yet, within this structured record, a large silence exists. Many women who once lived close to noble households do not appear in official documents at all. The mistresses, who influenced private lives, who shared rooms, conversations, and secrets with powerful men, often disappeared from written history almost completely. Their absence was not accidental. Aristocratic families had strong reasons to control what entered the official record. Documents preserved in family archives were meant to protect the legitimacy of inheritance and the reputation of the household. Anything that complicated that narrative was usually excluded. A lawful marriage strengthened the authority of the family line. The wife represented stability, alliance, and the continuation of legitimate heirs. For that reason, her presence appeared in legal agreements, property transfers, and genealogical records. Portraits, memorials, and inscriptions reinforced her place within the household's history. A mistress occupied a very different position. Even when she lived near the estate or maintained a relationship with the nobleman for many years, she did not belong within the official structure of family memory. Recording her presence would raise unnecessary questions about loyalty, inheritance, and moral reputation. Silence, therefore, became the simplest solution. Households preserved only the information that supported their public identity. The nobleman's marriage appeared as a clear turning point in the record, creating the impression that his domestic life began and remained within that legitimate framework. The earlier relationships that existed before marriage remained outside that narrative. Yet traces of these women sometimes survived in less formal sources. Private letters written between relatives occasionally mentioned them. A passing reference might appear in correspondence, describing a visit, a disagreement, or a financial arrangement. These fragments rarely offered detailed explanations. They appeared briefly and then vanished again within the flow of ordinary communication. Servants' accounts and personal diaries also preserved occasional glimpses. A steward might note an unusual payment sent to a distant residence. A visiting guest might mention encountering a woman connected quietly to the noble household. These remarks were often brief and indirect, reflecting the reluctance of observers to describe the situation openly. Through such fragments, historians can detect the outlines of lives that official records ignored. The women themselves rarely left documents of their own. Their letters might have been destroyed, lost, or deliberately removed from family archives. Without property or recognized legal status within the noble household, their voices seldom survived the passage of time. This absence shaped how history remembered the past. When later generations looked back through family papers, they encountered a carefully constructed story. The nobleman appeared as a husband and father, surrounded by legitimate heirs. The household seemed orderly, guided by marriage alliances and political strategy. The mistress who had once shared part of that life remained invisible. Her presence existed only in scattered references that many readers overlooked. Without sustained documentation, it became easy for later historians to focus entirely on the official narrative preserved by the family. Such patterns reveal an important truth about historical memory. Records do not capture every life equally. They reflect the priorities of the people who created and preserved them. In Tudor, aristocratic society, the legitimacy of inheritance mattered more than the complexity of personal relationships. Because of this priority, the wife received recognition while the mistress disappeared. The official story celebrated the marriage that secured alliances and produced heirs. The earlier relationship, which might have shaped the nobleman's private life for years, remained outside the boundaries of respectable history. Even so, the scattered fragments that survive remind us that those women once existed. They moved through corridors of noble estates, participated in private conversations, and shared moments of affection or tension that never entered formal records. Their lives formed part of the social reality surrounding aristocratic households. Yet the structure of historical documentation ensured that their stories faded. Family archives protected reputation. Genealogies recorded legitimacy. Public memory followed the same pattern, repeating the names of wives and heirs while leaving little space for those who had lived outside lawful recognition. The result was a quieter history beneath the visible one. A history composed not of official entries, but of hints, fragments, and brief mentions hidden inside letters that survived by chance. Many mistresses who once lived near noble households vanished from the official records that later defined Tudor history. Their names survived only in scattered letters and quiet references that revealed glimpses of lives never formally acknowledged. Behind the orderly story of marriage and inheritance, an entire group of women remained almost invisible within the written past. A marriage alliance between noble families in Tudor England was often described as a success long before the couple themselves had spent many years together. Success did not depend primarily on affection or personal happiness. Instead, it rested on whether the union achieved the political and economic goals that had inspired it in the first place. When two powerful households joined through marriage, the immediate effects could be seen quickly. Landholdings expanded through shared inheritance. Debts that once threatened a family might be balanced through the wealth of the bride's dowry. Political alliances formed new networks of cooperation that extended through courts, councils, and regional influence. The marriage created a structure of stability that both families could rely on. For observers within Tudor society, these outcomes represented clear evidence that the alliance had worked. Visitors who attended gatherings at the estate saw two families interacting comfortably. Correspondence between relatives reflected mutual respect. Invitations to feasts, hunts, and celebrations circulated freely between the households, reinforcing the connection that the marriage had created. Over time, the alliance strengthened further. Children born into the marriage secured the future of the family line. Each birth confirmed the success of the union and reinforced the legitimacy of the household's inheritance. Portraits of the growing family appeared within the estate, celebrating the continuity that aristocratic society valued above nearly everything else. To those outside the household, the story seemed straightforward. A nobleman had married wisely. His family gained influence, land, and stability. The bride entered a position of authority within the estate, representing both her birth family and the future of the household she now helped guide. Yet this picture of success contained a quieter dimension that rarely appeared in official records. The marriage alliance that strengthened two families had also required the removal of someone who could not remain within the structure of legitimacy. The mistress, who once occupied part of the nobleman's private life, disappeared from the visible world surrounding the estate. Her absence helped create the appearance of order. Without her presence, the household could present itself as unified and disciplined. Guests saw no trace of past complications. Conversations focused on alliances, heirs, and the prosperity of the estate. From the perspective of the families arranging the marriage, the outcome justified the decision. The alliance worked precisely because it removed uncertainties. A noble household built on clear lines of inheritance and recognized authority possessed far greater security than one entangled in unresolved relationships. Still, the disappearance of the mistress represented a cost that remained largely unspoken. She had once shared a life connected to the estate. Her daily routines, conversations, and relationships with servants and neighbors formed part of the household's earlier reality. When the marriage alliance demanded stability, that earlier reality was quietly dismantled. The removal did not require a dramatic confrontation. In many cases, it occurred through practical arrangements, financial settlements, relocation to another residence, or the promise of protection elsewhere allowed the transition to happen without public scandal. The household adjusted itself quickly to the new structure. Afterward, the attention shifted entirely to the future. Relatives celebrated the strength of the alliance. The nobleman and his wife appeared together at gatherings, presenting the image of a harmonious partnership. Each public appearance reinforced the idea that the marriage had created a successful and respectable household. Within this environment, memory itself changed. Servants, who once knew the mistress, adapted to new routines. Guests visiting the estate encountered only the official version of the household's history. Over time, the earlier relationship faded from everyday conversation. The success of the marriage, therefore, depended partly on forgetting. For the bride's family, forgetting preserved honor. For the nobleman, it secured his reputation as a disciplined husband. For the estate, it maintained the appearance of stability that allowed alliances to flourish. Yet somewhere beyond the estate walls lived the person whose removal had helped make that stability possible. The woman who had once occupied a place within the nobleman's life might continue her days quietly in another household, supported by arrangements that ensured her comfort, but not her recognition. Her existence remained separate from the narrative of success celebrated by the families. History often records the triumph of alliances while overlooking the individuals who disappeared to make them possible. The strengthening of two families could be measured through land, titles, and heirs. The absence of the mistress left no comparable record. Even so, her removal formed part of the invisible structure supporting the alliance. Without that absence, the marriage might never have appeared as stable or respectable as it did. The marriage alliance strengthened two noble families and secured the future of their estates. Land, influence, and legitimate heirs confirmed the success of the union in the eyes of Tudor society. Yet behind that success stood the quiet removal of a woman whose absence made the new order possible. Marriage among Tudor nobles rarely began as a story about affection. Within the great houses of England, marriage functioned as a deliberate strategy shaped by politics, property, and survival. Families negotiated alliances carefully, calculating how each union would strengthen their position in a world where power depended on land, loyalty, and reputation. A wedding, therefore, represented far more than a personal decision. It created a bridge between two families whose futures now became linked. Estates, titles, and influence passed through that bridge, binding generations together. When such a union succeeded, the stability it produced could shape political relationships for decades. Because of this, the structure surrounding marriage left little room for uncertainty. The expectations placed upon the groom and bride were clear. Their household must appear disciplined, loyal, and morally secure. Their children must inherit without question. Their alliance must strengthen the authority of both families rather than threaten it. Anything that challenged that order had to be removed. Private attachments that existed before the marriage became inconvenient within this structure. A mistress who had once shared the nobleman's life might have been accepted quietly while he remained unmarried, once negotiations for a formal alliance began. However, the relationship changed its meaning. What had once been private companionship now appeared as a risk. Families arranging the marriage understood that reputation shaped power. A nobleman who seemed divided between loyalty to his future wife and affection for another woman could undermine the trust necessary for the alliance to succeed. Stability demanded clarity. The household preparing for marriage, therefore, reorganized itself with remarkable precision. Servants altered routines. Advisors guided conversations. And relatives ensured that the nobleman's public behavior aligned with the expectations of a respectable husband. Within this process, the former mistress often disappeared from the household entirely. Her departure rarely created public drama. Tudor society preferred quiet solutions that avoided scandal. A financial settlement, relocation to another residence, or a promise of future protection allowed the separation to occur without drawing attention. From the outside, the estate appeared unchanged. Guests visiting the household encountered an environment filled with preparation for the coming wedding. Discussions focused on alliances, inheritances, and the future children who would secure the family line. The past remained silent, yet that silence carried meaning. The stability celebrated by relatives and political allies depended on a carefully managed absence. Without removing the earlier relationship, the marriage alliance might have appeared fragile or uncertain. The disappearance of the mistress, therefore, helped create the very image of order that the household wished to display. Within Tudor society, this outcome seemed practical. Power required predictability. Families relied on clear structures of loyalty and inheritance to maintain their position within the complex network of aristocratic politics. Personal emotions rarely outweighed those responsibilities. Affection could exist within marriage, but it was never its primary purpose. Marriage first protected property and alliances. Emotional connection, if it developed, came afterward. The priorities of aristocratic life placed family interests above individual desires. The fate of the mistress reflected that reality. Her presence belonged to a private chapter of the nobleman's life. When that chapter conflicted with the needs of a political alliance, the larger structure prevailed. The household continued forward, strengthened by the union that replaced the earlier relationship. History often remembers the visible results of these alliances. Records describe marriages, inheritances, and the children who carried family names into future generations. Portraits display noble couples surrounded by symbols of stability and prosperity. Less visible are the individuals who disappeared from those narratives. The women who once lived near noble households, whose relationships shaped private moments in the lives of powerful men, often vanished from official memory. Once marriage rearranged the structure of the estate, their absence allowed the official story to appear simple. A nobleman married wisely. Two families united. Legitimate heirs continued the line. The household prospered under the authority of marriage. Yet beneath that orderly narrative existed quieter histories. Lives moved away from the estate. letters faded, and memories softened into fragments, preserved only in scattered correspondence. The structure of aristocratic society encouraged forgetting, because forgetting protected stability. Looking back now, the pattern becomes clearer. Marriage alliances strengthened families and secured power, but they also required sacrifices that rarely entered official records. Private affection could be set aside when it conflicted with the demands of reputation and inheritance. In the Tudor world, stability carried more value than sentiment. Power favored arrangements that ensured order across generations. Individual relationships mattered only as long as they supported that order. Once they threatened it, they disappeared. The noble households that dominated Tudor society survived through this careful balance of loyalty, discipline, and silence. Their alliances shaped the political landscape of England for decades. Behind many of those alliances, however, stood stories that remained unwritten. Stories of women who once belonged to those households but left no trace in the official memory that followed. In Tudor society, marriage functioned less as a declaration of love and more as a structure designed to protect power. Families strengthened alliances and secured their future by placing reputation and inheritance above personal feeling. Within that order, the mistress became the first person whose presence had to disappear. Thank you for spending this quiet time exploring the hidden corners of Tudor history. Stories like these remind us that behind the formal portraits and grand alliances of the past lived individuals whose lives rarely appeared in official records. Their experiences shaped the private reality of noble households, even when history chose not to remember them. As the halls of Tudor estates grew silent at night, the records preserved alliances and heirs, while many other lives faded into the background of time. Now the candles in those great halls have long burned out, and the voices that once filled them have grown quiet. May this story settle gently into the calm rhythm of the evening, and may your thoughts drift peacefully through the distant echoes of history. Good night, and sleep well.